In May 1968, at the height of the Cold War, a nuclear submarine of the United States Navy simply stopped answering. No distress call, no emergency signal, no final message. If you value forgotten military history and real stories that were never fully explained, subscribe now. These are the stories that were never meant to be remembered. The submarine was USS Scorpion SSN 589, a skipjack-class nuclear attack submarine, fast, deep diving, and designed to hunt Soviet vessels in the open ocean. She carried 99 men. They were not recruits. They were trained submariners, officers, engineers, sonar operators, men who lived their lives hundreds of feet below the surface, trusting steel, training, and procedures to keep them alive. USS Scorpion had departed for patrol earlier that year, operating in the Atlantic during a period of extreme tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was not a time of peace. This was a time of constant shadow warfare beneath the waves. Submarines followed each other silently, tracked each other for days, listened, waited. Every patrol carried risk, but Scorpion was supposed to come home. In late May, the submarine was returning to Norfolk, Virginia, after completing her mission. She was expected to arrive within days. Families were waiting. Dock crews were prepared. Nothing about the schedule was unusual. Then she missed her first check-in. At first, no one panicked. Submarines often went silent temporarily. Radio contact could be delayed. Atmospheric conditions affected transmissions. This had happened before, but then another scheduled communication passed, and another. The silence stretched. By May 27, USS Scorpion was officially overdue. The U.S. Navy initiated quiet internal procedures. They did not announce anything publicly. They did not alert the press. They did not notify families. Instead, they began searching. The Atlantic Ocean is vast. Searching it is not like searching land. There were no wreckage fields, no oil slicks, no distress flares, only water. Listening stations were checked. Sonar recordings were reviewed. Analysts began scanning old acoustic data, looking for anything unusual, any sound that could indicate an implosion, an explosion, or structural failure. What they eventually found would only raise more questions. Several days after the submarine disappeared, underwater listening systems recorded a series of acoustic events in the North Atlantic, southwest of the Azores. The sounds were not immediately identified, but they were later classified as consistent with a catastrophic event at depth. Something had happened, something violent, but the exact cause was unclear. The Navy faced a nightmare scenario. A nuclear-powered submarine lost with all hands in deep water during the Cold War. Publicly, the Navy said almost nothing. Privately, pressure mounted. Was it an accident? Was it a mechanical failure? Or was it something far worse? Rumors began circulating even inside the military. Some whispered about a collision with a Soviet submarine. Others suggested an internal explosion. A few quietly asked the unthinkable question, had the submarine been attacked? Officially, none of these possibilities were confirmed. Weeks turned into months. Finally, the Navy launched one of the deepest and most complex underwater search operations ever attempted. Using experimental deep-sea technology, they scanned thousands of square miles of ocean floor. In October 1968, they found her. USS Scorpion lay broken on the seabed, more than 3,000 meters deep. The wreckage told a disturbing story. The submarine's hull was shattered. Sections were crushed inward, as if the pressure had overwhelmed the structure. The sail was damaged. The bow section showed signs of internal destruction. This was not a simple sinking. It was a sudden, catastrophic loss. The Navy conducted extensive investigations. Engineers analyzed the wreckage. Acoustic experts reviewed sonar data. Classified reports were written and locked away. Eventually, the Navy issued an official conclusion. The cause of the loss was listed as unknown. Unofficially, several theories emerged. One involved a faulty Mark 37 torpedo, which may have detonated inside the submarine. Another suggested a battery failure that caused an explosion. A third proposed that structural weaknesses led to collapse under pressure. And then there was the theory that was never proven but never fully dismissed. that USS Scorpion may have been lost during an encounter with a Soviet submarine. At the time, Soviet naval activity in the Atlantic was intense. Both sides tracked each other relentlessly. Submarines followed enemy vessels for days at close range, sometimes within a few hundred meters. One mistake, one collision, one misinterpreted maneuver, and silence would follow. The U.S. Navy denied this possibility. So did the Soviet Union. No official records confirm a confrontation. No evidence has ever been released, and so the truth remained buried beneath miles of water. Families of the crew were notified that their loved ones were lost at sea. They were told there would be no recovery. The depth made it impossible. The wreck would remain where it lay. 99 men. No bodies returned. No final answers. USS Scorpion became one of the most haunting losses of the Cold War. A submarine that left on patrol, a crew that never came home, a disappearance that raised questions no one could fully answer. And this was only the beginning, because what the Navy discovered next and what they chose not to say would make the story even darker. After the wreck of USS Scorpion was located, the United States Navy faced a problem it could not solve publicly. The submarine had not simply sunk, it had been destroyed. The depth at which Scorpion lay made recovery impossible. More than 3,000 meters below the surface, the pressure was extreme, the environment hostile, and the technology of the late 1960s barely capable of observation, let alone salvage. Whatever answers existed would have to be extracted from fragments, sound recordings, and inputs. The Navy assembled multiple investigative teams. Naval engineers studied the design of the skipjack-class hull. Acoustic analysts reviewed classified underwater recordings. Weapons specialists examined the behavior of torpedoes carried aboard Scorpion. Medical and nuclear experts assessed whether the reactor could have played a role. Nothing aligned cleanly. The submarine's nuclear reactor was found intact. There was no evidence of a nuclear incident. Radiation levels around the wreck were consistent with normal containment. This eliminated one of the most feared possibilities early. What remained were mechanical failure, weapons malfunction, or external interaction. The most widely discussed internal theory focused on the Mark 37 torpedo. The Mark 37 was a homing torpedo powered by a battery system known to have problems. In earlier incidents, overheating batteries had caused malfunctions. In extreme cases, they could detonate prematurely. USS Scorpion carried these torpedoes. If one had activated inside the tube or near the bow, it could have caused catastrophic damage. A secondary explosion could have followed. Pressure would have finished the job. This explanation satisfied many engineers, but not all. The acoustic data suggested distinct events separated by several seconds. The first sound was consistent with a small explosion. The second was far more violent, consistent with a full hull collapse at depth. This raised questions. If the initial explosion was internal, why did the submarine not surface or transmit a distress signal? Even damaged submarines often had timed seconds, sometimes minutes, to send a final message. USS Scorpion sent nothing. No emergency buoy was released. No radio transmission was detected. No change in course was recorded. The silence was absolute. Some investigators began looking elsewhere. At the time of Scorpion's disappearance, the Atlantic was crowded with submarines. Both American and Soviet vessels were operating aggressively, shadowing each other, testing responses, probing limits. This was the Cold War at sea. Encounters were not recorded. Near misses were not acknowledged. Mistakes were buried. If Scorpion had collided with another submarine, especially at speed, the damage could have been catastrophic. A collision at depth would explain the lack of warning and the rapid destruction. But admitting such an event would have consequences far beyond the loss of one submarine. It would imply uncontrolled contact between nuclear-armed forces. It would raise questions about escalation. It would suggest that the Cold War had already come dangerously close to catastrophe, without the public ever knowing. No government wanted that narrative. The Navy officially dismissed collision theories. They also dismissed the idea of an attack. There was no declaration of war, no confirmed hostile engagement, no intercepted communications indicating Soviet responsibility. And yet, classified Soviet naval logs from that period remain incomplete. Some former Soviet officers later hinted never on record that unusual incidents occurred in the Atlantic in 1968. No specifics were given. No names were mentioned. Only implication. Meanwhile, the families of the crew waited. They were told the submarine had been lost at sea. They were told there would be no recovery. They were told the investigation was ongoing. What they were not told was how uncertain everything remained. As months passed, internal Navy reports began to contradict each other. Some emphasized torpedo failure. Others focused on structural integrity issues. A few quietly noted anomalies that did not fit any known failure pattern. One internal memo described the loss as inconsistent with a single-point mechanical failure. That memo was classified. In 1969, the Navy closed the primary investigation. The final report stated that USS Scorpion was lost due to an unknown cause, likely related to mechanical failure. The language was careful, vague, non-committal. The case was considered closed, but it was not forgotten. Over the following decades, independent researchers, former submariners, and Cold War historians continued to study the incident. Some gained access to partial documents. Others interviewed retired personnel who spoke more freely once out of uniform. Patterns emerged. USS Scorpion had been operating under heavy workload. Maintenance had been deferred. Some systems were overdue for repair. The submarine had been cleared for deployment despite known issues. This raised another uncomfortable possibility, that Scorpion should never have been at sea in the first place. If the submarine had been pushed beyond safe limits, if known risks were accepted under Cold War pressure, then the loss was not an accident, it was a consequence. That explanation, too, was never officially embraced. Admitting it would mean admitting responsibility, and responsibility during the Cold War was carefully avoided. The wreck itself remained untouched. Occasional deep-sea missions photographed it. The images showed a broken hull scattered across the seabed. Sections lay hundreds of meters apart. The damage pattern suggested sudden failure, not slow flooding. The man aboard had almost certainly died instantly. That fact brought little comfort. For many families, the lack of answers was worse than loss itself. There was no story to tell, no final moments to understand, no closure, only silence. USS Scorpion became a symbol of something deeper than a submarine disaster. It became a reminder that during the Cold War, not everything was controlled, not everything was understood, and not every loss could be explained without risking truths. That governments preferred to keep buried. The ocean kept its secrets, and the Navy learned that some questions, once asked, could never be fully answered. But one fact remained undeniable. A nuclear submarine disappeared in peacetime. 99 men died, and no one could say exactly why. And that uncertainty more than any explosion was the most dangerous legacy of all. In the years after the loss of USS Scorpion, the Cold War continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Submarines kept sailing. Patrols continued. Official doctrine did not change. Publicly, the disappearance of Scorpion was treated as a tragic but isolated incident and unfortunate. Mechanical failure in an unforgiving environment. Privately, it never sat right. Within the submarine community, the loss of Scorpion lingered as an unspoken warning. Officers did not discuss it openly, but training materials quietly changed. Maintenance standards were rewritten. Weapons handling procedures were tightened. Battery systems were scrutinized more closely. The Navy did not say why these changes were necessary. They simply implemented them. This alone suggested uncertainty. If the cause had been clearly understood, there would have been no need for such widespread revision. One of the most troubling aspects of the Scorpion case was timing. The submarine disappeared during a period when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were escalating in subtle but dangerous ways. Both sides were expanding undersea operations, pushing submarines closer to enemy coastlines, and increasing the frequency of shadowing missions. Submarines were no longer just deterrents. They were active intelligence platforms. USS Scorpion had been tasked with monitoring Soviet naval activity. That fact was never denied. What was never fully disclosed was how close she may have been operating to Soviet vessels, or for how long. Former submariners later described Cold War patrols as games of chicken played in silence. Vessels followed each other at dangerously close distances. Sonar operators tracked enemy screws for hours. Commanders made judgment calls in darkness, relying on incomplete data and instinct. A single error could be fatal, and if that error involved two nuclear powers, the consequences would be unthinkable. This is where the official record grows thin. Requests to declassify all materials related to Scorpion were repeatedly denied or delayed. Some documents were released with heavy redactions. Others were declared lost or destroyed. Even decades later, full transparency was never granted. That absence of information became part of the story. In the 1990s, as Cold War archives slowly opened, researchers began revisiting underwater acoustic data from 1968. Independent analysts compared U.S. Navy recordings with international monitoring systems. They confirmed the presence of a sharp acoustic event followed by a much larger implosion sequence. The sequence suggested sudden loss of control. What it did not explain was why. One particularly controversial theory proposed that Scorpion may have been tracking a Soviet submarine that detected her presence. In such a scenario, even a minor collision or near collision could have caused damage severe enough to trigger a chain reaction of failures. This theory remains unproven. So does every other theory. What is known is that the wreckage pattern of Scorpion differs from that of USS Thresher, another nuclear submarine lost in 1963. Thresher's loss was eventually attributed to a combination of mechanical failure and inadequate safety protocols. Her hull collapse was more uniform, her descent more gradual. Scorpion's destruction was different. Fragments were scattered. Damage was asymmetric. The forward section appeared to have suffered internal trauma before collapse. These observations fueled speculation, but speculation is not evidence. The Navy remained firm. No hostile action was involved. Yet some former officials, speaking anonymously years later, admitted that the full picture was never clear even to those conducting the investigation. One former analyst described the case as the one we never closed, only shelved. That distinction mattered. Shelved cases are not resolved. They are set aside because resolution is inconvenient, dangerous, or impossible with available information. USS Scorpion fell into all three categories. The families of the crew lived with that reality. Many attended memorial services held without remains. Names were engraved on plaques. Medals were awarded posthumously. Official language emphasized sacrifice and duty. What it did not provide was explanation. Some families pursued answers for decades. They filed information requests. They contacted retired officers. They consulted independent experts. What they found was contradiction. Different reports cited different cousins. Timelines varied slightly. Some documents referenced tests that others did not mention. The story shifted depending on who told it. That inconsistency eroded trust. For submariners still serving, Scorpion became a cautionary example whispered during training. Not a ghost story, but a reminder that not every patrol ended with a return, that technology failed, that procedures were imperfect, that silence could be final. In 1998, 30 years after the loss, the Navy released additional information, reaffirming its original conclusion. Mechanical failure remained the most likely cause. No new evidence was presented. By then, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The world had changed, yet the questions remained. If Scorpion had been lost today with modern sensors, real-time satellite communication, and advanced tracking, the outcome might have been different. Or it might not have been. Even now, the ocean remains largely opaque. Vast areas are unmonitored. Sound travels in unpredictable ways. Depth defeats observation. The sea does not reveal its secret easily. USS Scorpion lies where it fell, undisturbed and reachable. A steel tomb on the ocean floor. 99 men sealed inside history. There is no monument above the water. No marker visible from the surface. Ships pass overhead without knowing what lies below. The submarine did not explode in a blaze of war. It did not die in battle. It vanished in peacetime during a conflict that was officially not a war at all. That contradiction defines its its legacy. The loss of USS Scorpion exposed the hidden dangers of a conflict fought in silence. It showed that the Cold War was not bloodless. It simply hid its casualties beneath the surface. It also revealed the limits of control. Governments plan, militaries calculate, engineers design systems meant to withstand the impossible. And yet, sometimes a machine disappears, and no one can say exactly why. The official record may never change. The truth may never be fully known. But the story of USS Scorpion endures not because of what is known, but because of what is missing. A final transmission that never came. An answer that never arrived. A silence that still echoes beneath the Atlantic. By the time the Cold War ended, the loss of USS Scorpion had already been absorbed into institutional memory, not as a solved case, but as a managed one. It existed in archives, in restricted briefings, in the quiet knowledge shared among submariners who understood what it meant to disappear beneath the ocean without explanation. Officially, the matter was settled, and officially, it never was. The Navy's final position rested on probability rather than certainty. Mechanical failure was deemed the most likely cause, not because it was proven, but because it was the least destabilizing explanation. It did not implicate foreign powers. It did not suggest escalation. It did not require uncomfortable admissions about readiness, risk, or operational pressure. In Cold War logic, that mattered. Admitting uncertainty at that level carried consequences. If a nuclear submarine could be lost without explanation during peacetime, then deterrence itself was imperfect. Confidence mattered as much as capability. The appearance of control was part of the system, and so the narrative hardened. USS Scorpion became an example of the ocean's danger, not of strategic miscalculation. Yet inside the submarine force, the lesson was absorbed differently. Commanders became more cautious. Patrol routes were adjusted. Maintenance deferments were scrutinized more heavily. Subtle changes appeared in doctrine, changes that were never officially attributed to Scorpion, but which aligned too closely with its unresolved questions to be coincidence. The submarine community understood something had gone wrong at a level deeper than a single malfunction. What made the Scorpion case especially unsettling was how ordinary it began. There was no emergency deployment, no high-risk mission announced to the crew, no expectation of confrontation. The submarine was returning home. This detail haunted those who studied the case. Losses during combat were tragic but comprehensible. Losses during routine movement were harder to accept. They suggested vulnerability even in moments of relative calm. For the families, this distinction mattered deeply. Many had been told their sons and husbands were on a normal patrol, that they were coming home, that the danger was theoretical, distant, managed. Then communication stopped. In the weeks that followed, families received carefully worded updates that said very little. The Navy emphasized the difficulty of undersea operations, the vastness of the ocean, the reality that submarines were designed to be silent and unseen. What they did not say was how uncertain they were. Some families later learned that multiple theories had been considered and discarded without resolution. Others learned that key documents remained classified long after any strategic value had expired. The sense that something was being withheld never fully faded. This was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Throughout the Cold War, incidents that threatened escalation were routinely minimized or obscured. Near misses were buried. Accidents were reframed. The priority was stability, not transparency. USS Scorpion fit that pattern. Even today, complete acoustic data from the time of the loss has never been fully released. Portions remain classified. Reasons given include national security, protection of sensor capabilities, and diplomatic sensitivity. Decades later, these justifications are increasingly difficult to defend. What remains is silence by design. The wreck itself has been left undisturbed. Unlike some deep-sea sites that become memorials or research locations, Scorpion remains off-limits. The Navy has stated that the site is a war grave and should not be interfered with. That is true, but it also prevents further analysis. Advances in underwater imaging, metallurgy, and acoustic modeling could potentially provide new insights, yet no such effort has been authorized. The risk of reopening old questions appears greater than the benefit of answers. This decision, too, carries weight. It suggests that even now, the full truth may be inconvenient. As years passed, the men of USS Scorpion faded from public awareness. There were no anniversaries widely observed, no major films, Renewed investigations that captured attention. Other events of the Cold War filled the narrative: missile crises, proxy wars, political collapses. The submarine remained a footnote, but among those who study military history closely, Scorpion occupies a unique space. It represents the hidden cost of deterrence, the price paid not in open battle, but in preparation, pressure, and secrecy. It reminds us that the Cold War was not a peaceful standoff punctuated only by diplomacy. It was a continuous state of risk. Men died without shots being fired. Mistakes had consequences even when no one admitted them. USS Scorpion also highlights the limits of technology. Nuclear submarines were marvels of engineering, but they were not invulnerable. They operated in an environment where small failures could cascade rapidly, where detection meant exposure, where recovery was often impossible. The margin for error was thin. In that context, the disappearance of Scorpion is less an anomaly and more a warning. A warning that complexity does not eliminate danger, it concentrates it. For the submariners who followed, this knowledge shaped careers. Some served longer with heightened caution. Others left the service early, unwilling to accept risks they could not quantify. Many carried the loss quietly, aware that speaking openly served no purpose. The silence became part of the culture. In recent years, renewed interest in Cold War history has brought Scorpion back into discussion. Podcasts, books, and independent analyses revisit the case with modern tools. Yet all arrive at the same conclusion: there is no definitive answer, and perhaps there never will be. The ocean does not preserve events the way land does. Pressure destroys evidence. Time corrodes detail. Memory erodes context. What remains is inference. USS Scorpion may have been lost to mechanical failure, to a weapons malfunction, to structural weakness, or to an encounter never acknowledged. Each theory explains part of the evidence. None explains all of it. That unresolved tension is the story. It is the reason the submarine still matters. In a conflict defined by secrecy, the most honest legacy of USS Scorpion may be uncertainty itself. 99 men went to sea. They did not return. The reasons remain debated, and that ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects the reality of a war fought beneath the surface, where silence was both a tactic and a consequence, and where some losses were never meant to be fully understood. USS Scorpion does not rest as a symbol of heroism or defeat. It rests as evidence of the cost of hidden conflict, a reminder that even when nations avoid open war, individuals still pay the price. And sometimes, all that is left behind is a silence no investigation can completely break.